To those who think gynocentrism is inescapable, inevitable, biological, necessary, or worse, good in some amounts, I will now attempt to remind them that gynocentrism is an aberration, a social pathology, and a form of collectivism that needs to be fought if we are to resolve any given men's issue and actually attain a meaningful definition of equality of the sexes, in which one sex is not privileged over the other. Gynocentrism can be absurdly tempting to utilize in order to make some points about the alleged traditional roles of the sexes or of real biological differences between the sexes, or even ironically critiquing feminism. One tactic used by a lot of women, and sadly some men who think that they're speaking for women's benefit and trying to get on the women's good side as well, is to argue something along the lines of women are affected by men's issues too, as if that is the missing factor to start caring about men. I know now we can care about men. And the end goal appears to be how women are most affected anyway when they use this argument. Others use the argument that men are and should be disposable so as to ensure continuance of the human race during times of conflict. To think that those types of arguers can actually claim to be opposed to gynocentrism is baffling to me, as this is an act of pedestalizing women for a supposed inherent value that they have that's thoroughly challenged anyway if you scrutinize it well enough. Read the writings of Peter Ryan, aka the anti-gynocentrist, especially the fallacy of the golden uterus and the normalization of gynocentrism, for some dispelling of commonly assumed notions about male expendability when looking at the big picture of Homo sapiens. I would like to hereby address 5 hard truths about gynocentrism and why it needs to end. Number 5. Gynocentrism is neither natural nor intrinsic to society and male nature. In order to examine the extent of gynocentrism that evolutionary psychologists and biologists seem to want to justify in their postulates, we have to recognize that the sciences are also sadly overrun with gynocentrism to begin with. It's bad enough that feminism and postmodern ideology has been made mainstream enough that those sensibilities seep into the indoctrination, but if any of the pushback against it is also aiming for gynocentric ends, then it's easy to see why the fight seems futile. The differences of men and women, in behavioral terms and in physicality, seem to favor the idea of the overvaluing and protection of females, and also treating men like they can be replaced. We'll get into what I think is the main culprit behind why males are seen as sacrificial in points 2 and 1, but for now I'll say that men's existence is justified by evolutionary psychologists due to the fact that they protect, provide, and they are, in their words, hardwired to do so. Instinct is another word that comes up. Hardwired implies a lack of volition and an absence of free will. And where instinct dominates, conscious thought wanes. But we are talking about a point in the evolution of the human species in which he has attained the ability to contemplate his existence, apply his will to conscious acts, and at the very least attempt to control his own destiny, not as a mere iteration of his own species, like other animals have been, but instead as a self-aware individual. Evolutionary psychology has no explanation nor support for the fact that humans have evolved to transcend their evolutions. If I'm wrong here, go ahead and tell me, but I haven't seen it right now. If you want to generalize and control people, you sell them the idea that their free will is an illusion and that their sense of volition is nothing but a collection of impulses. I deem this to be non-disprovable, and akin to the non-disprovability of the idea that the universe is a big holographic simulation. The point I'm trying to make here is that in order to sell male disposability in gynocentrism, one denies men the notion that they have volition, that they respond consciously to values, and that they always have, at least since man started attaining individual contemplation in the way I've just described. You sell male hardwiring, and you sell male instinct, the opposites of free will and conscious thought. In effect, this states that men do not think, they just can't help but become sacrificial for the sake of womankind. Such is the error of the biological determinist and those who take their words too much at heart. But you might be asking right now, if instinct had nothing to do with it, Why has gynocentrism taken hold? As with everything, it has to do with the realm of ideas, or perhaps in this case, the conscious suppression thereof. Gynocentrism needed a moral reason to continue because those who demanded it must have known that it can't continue as a matter of course now that humankind attained their sense of individuality. Why do these scientists insist on the determinist narrative for gynocentrism and male disposability? The same as any non-scientist, the approval of the women. Male sacrifice sells, and women are no less incentivized to continue to take advantage of it. Independent men, men going their own way, and men who refuse to conform are seen as undesirable and pathetic weasels by women, and too many men reinforce this notion by ironically playing the part of weasel in order to accrue favors and recognition from condescending women and throw their fellow men under the bus, as it were. What is natural to the human, be it in his earliest stages of what he is to those of today, is that he is free to think and make decisions that he deems best for himself and for everything that he values in this world, including certain other people. A man's masculinity is not dumb hardwiring into certain sets of behavior, but is manifested in how he uses his free will to apply his physical, biological, and personal existence as a man, ideally, unabashedly, and without shame. Gynocentrism is an anathema to what is natural to the human, so much that he had to be tricked into adopting it as a moral imperative, and the result is the torture of his ego from within, and demonization and no-quarter attitudes from men and women from without. Other results are actual male disposal in senseless wars, expectation to actually disregard their own life, and appallingly low regard for men in the medical world. Ask yourself here, is this natural for the human man with all his potential for what his free will can be applied to? On this basis, gynocentrism needs to end. Number 4, gynocentrism is not part and parcel to male sexuality. It is, however, part and parcel to mitigating and attacking it. In a way, it's easy to confuse the general male sex drive towards the pursuit of women as an instance of bio-gynocentrism, but I don't see it this way at all. For purposes of this talk, I want to talk in particular about the heterosexual dynamic, which I prefer to call classic sexuality, actually. I am of the mindset that a key characteristic of human sexuality is the ability to extract the desire from sexual fulfillment away from the biological imperative to procreate. Well before birth control was even invented, the preoccupation of sex for men, and yes, that of women, has been relegated to a personal, individualistic level, as a pursuit of experience, sensation, values, and connection, rather than the often touted need to continue his species. Classically, it's quite natural for men to desire women physically, and invest a lot of thought in the creation and consumption of, shall we say, supernormal substitutes and entertainment in the form of erotic art and pornography, nowadays even with sex dolls and other substitutes. All of this is entailed in the array of the male sexual universe and maleness itself, but it's not gynocentrism. Gynocentrism is in direct contradiction to unabashed maleness, and rather sees male sexual desire as a threat to womankind. Either a man would supposedly dirty a woman through the sexual act, or a man is simply derided as only concerned about his own needs and objectifies women as a sex object and not as a person, which are the usual suspect in female victimization narratives. Men are expected to be those who must please women sexually, but is frustrated due to the fact that her very physical nature of such pleasure is not so outwardly obvious. Gynocentrism pedestalizes women whose attentions men must earn through ridiculous trials culminating in him being on his knees to enter a marriage, an act which could either humiliate him on the spot or set him up for a life situation that could backfire at a whim, her whim. Traditionalists love to sell the idea that men will have the best sex in a monogamous married relationship, but the reality is that this is all a big lie, as it turns out, because men may not get all the sex that they wanted in the marriage when they signed up for it, when the woman turns off from him, and even less as they start having children, from which attention is diverted from husband to children. and still the husband is expected to protect and provide like a good beast of burden. Male sexuality, if expressed without undue shame, will allow itself to enjoy simple pleasures, even those things mistaken as harmful by traditionalists, such as pornography. In present times, it's hard to remember that pornography didn't actually involve modern levels of sheer simping when it was proliferating in the early days. The danger does, of course, lie in simping, which is a clear indicator that men are not unabashed about their sexual entertainment and gratification in the modern day. If anything, it's a clear indicator that men feel unworthy to consume porn without inane groveling and self-mortification and screaming, respect the whammons, respect the sex worker, etc. It's just a lot of insane, on your knees type of deal here. Gynocentrism and simping, but I repeat myself, are symptoms of how starved male sexuality has been, and not that there's an abundance of it. What is abundant is the need for men to let loose and express their sexuality without the psychotically imposed shame that would surround it. It was bad enough that Puritanism had to have a place in history, but in the modern day, what calls itself sex doesn't allow for the satisfaction of mystery, mystique, and playful fun that healthy sexuality must entail. What too many erroneously call the over-sexualization of society is really a zombified parody of sexuality that spoils the surprises and murders the mysteries, thereby starving a crucial aspect of the sexual pursuit. I liken this to the story of Tantalus, in which the Greek mythological figure of Tantalus is left thirsty standing in a pool of water and not allowed to drink. If Tantalus degraded himself to beg for the drink of water as well as to eat from the branches of fruit he cannot attain, then we have ourselves a simp. Pornography, as we've understood it for some time, for the most part used to be an underground aspect of male sexuality in which a man can indulge in sexual entertainment in his own terms, because goodness knows he couldn't attain it with his own wife, if that were the situation. For the same reasons, prostitutes may have also been an option. Well, we have a strange situation right now with the unconditional demand of the respect for sexual women just because, and that enables them to tantalize desperate, starved men. Maybe the tides can turn with the advent of the sex doll and other sexual robotics, or if men got off their white horses and stayed off their knees and stand for their own dignity. Or both. For all its unabashed pursuit of women, classic male sexuality is thus outlined as non-gynocentric. It, in fact, defies gynocentrism that demands male subjugation to women and allows men to attain a semblance of sexual satisfaction in their day-to-day lives on their own terms. Gynocentrism tries to cut this down, both to supposedly protect women from lustful men and to completely redirect men's sexual sense of purpose to the exclusive pleasing of women. Male pursuit of his own pleasure is seen as improper in these cases. So prevalent is this misguided set of values that men are demanded their foreskins cut to mitigate pleasure seeking in this way. And what better way to ensure that than to inflict it on 8-day-old male children? Gynocentrism is a literal knife on manhood and must thoroughly come to an end. Number 3. Anti-gynocentrism is not the men's version of feminist victimhood. This was worth bringing up because I know for sure that there are those who would think that combating gynocentrism, or even so much as having any position supportive of men's rights and bringing attention to men's issues, is just the men's version of feminism, or the men's version of victimhood and identitarianism. Certainly pseudo-assets like the likes of Kathy Young and Christina Hoff Sommers certainly seem to think so. I won't get off track here though, so I'll stick to the gynocentrism specifically. In the minds of those who hypothetically complain about those that seek to address and fight gynocentrism, what they're going to think is that the position of gynocentrism must end is akin to smash the patriarchy. Again, that male equivalent of feminist victimhood or something. Let's put this to rest here. If we look at the honest fight against gynocentrism, the core complaint, our core case, is the fact that one sex is pedestalized over the other. I'll remind the viewer that pedestalization is that which is often bestowed upon those that see themselves as victims. The women are placed above the men, and the men are regarded as disposable, expendable, and in any way it's referred to as less valuable. Feminists keep on repeating the same mistake that the patriarchy, such that it benefits men over women, supposedly even exists. In terms of the past, there's been a burden constantly upon men as a whole and upon women as a whole. It's fair to say that both sexes had it pretty bad, weighed down by the forces of nature and the considerations thereof. What feminists and those who try to get on their good side think is male privilege was basically perceived elevated status for men doing what men could do physically, coupled with what I call social trickery involving promising rewards and honors and gratitude for basically sending themselves out in the world to be killed for the sake of protecting the female of the species. This ignores the fact that anyone who was privileged in any meaningful sense of the term were higher class people anyway, who largely lived in luxury, and both men and women shared in that aristocracy. Well, at least that's my understanding of it. In terms of recent memory and in the present day, women who had the literal luxury to complain about a perceived lack of rights, including the vote, established themselves as feminists and demanded those rights, with none of the burdens and responsibilities associated with them. And those rights they got. The fact that we who are anti-gynocentric try to bring to light the issue in which men are still the ones burdened with the expectation to hold up society at the expense of self, that they are expected to have their sex demonized at every step of the way and their masculinity made unwelcome with the exception of when it serves these women, and express their right to do something else with their lives than get on their knees for women for marriage only for them to be financially and personally decimated by a divorce, does not make this a victimhood narrative for men. It is distinct from feminism, which states that women carry the legacy of the downtrodden and must be eternally and asymptotically compensated and made content until they can find the next grievance. In short, feminism is the pursuit of grievances that will spell the next demand of societal help. Gynocentrism itself finds a way to make this keep on happening, as it always has and will if it's not put to a thorough stop. All gynocentrism, including feminism, is the call to female non-accountability in any context it touches. The fight against gynocentrism is the fight against victimhood mentality and the identitarianism of women and idiot men who say things as, the future is female. The men's movement, properly at least, is not an identitarian movement. It's about men escaping the societal shackles of gynocentric expectation and a call for men to live according to their own values and their own terms. It really is about attacking an imposed identitarianism by both conservative types who think we should go back to the so-called good old days of when men had strict roles, gynocentric to the core by the way, imposed on them, to progressives who malign men for being men and then accuse us of being anywhere from racists to misogynists or just angry people just for complaining about being maligned as such. Again, anti-gynocentrism is not male victimhood, nor a form of identitarian political posturing. It is, by definition, what fights victimhood and identitarianism. These are intolerable for everyone, men and women, and must end. Number 2, gynocentrism is predicated on the downtrodden woman and the matching of men to women's supposed level. I will let you in on a theory I have regarding the treatment of men and women in human history. It came to a point that it wasn't enough after all to merely regard women as intrinsically valuable just because they are women. An added condition had to be applied to the general morality the more the very idea of moral behavior began to get traction. Hence, the idea of the downtrodden by birth female came into being. In the book of Genesis, Eve is established as both being blamed for eating the apple and the one whose sin was understandable, considering that it was the literal devil that deceived her. While some like to perceive this as an indictment of Eve as a representation of womankind, instead, Eve is portrayed as an object of pity, sympathy, and TLC. Compounding upon this are what we call punishments towards Eve in the form of painful childbirth and rule over her as a woman by her husband. What men and women are conditioned to think are not a sense of serves you right, but again, women as an object of that tender, loving care for simply being woman. Woman is now both valued and downtrodden, measured against men who are regarded as both pathetic and well-off at the same time. Woman is portrayed as being sacrificial by default due to the burden of childhood and rule by husband. While religious traditionalists try to sell the idea of coverture of husbands being above wives and the divine hierarchy so that men can derive a sense of respect, the harsh reality of this arrangement is that men are pathetic by design and must match the supposed sacrificial status of women by physical immolation, consignment to a beast of burden status, and resignation to tasks and statuses that render him expendable compared to the overprotected women. A case in point to this is the idea of menstruation as among the penalties divinely imposed upon womankind. All the same points I've made thus far apply here in terms of the TLC regarding bleeding women, and added to that is the fact that male-created feminine goods that both deal with the business of menstruation to even regulating the cycle itself is a sign enough that women are nothing but cared for in this respect. However, Jordan Peterson, in his talk Biblical Series 9, Sodom and Gomorrah, he likens male genital mutilation, or what he euphemistically calls circumcision, as the male equivalent to the female bleeding. For those curious, I do intend to do a video addressing Peterson's remarks in due time. Just you wait, it's going to happen. But herein lies the point. Men, even at absurdly young ages, have sacrificial acts done upon them to match the downtrodden women, the supposedly downtrodden woman. This is particularly the psychotic dimension of gynocentrism, in which men are actually put in physical danger just for the mission to match the sacrificial status of women. The worst part of all this is that it's all for nothing. It's bad enough that we have to do this leveling of the playing field bullshit to address such a matter of women as if they really were sacrificial. It's basically Marxist in its ideological application. But as much as black pillars and many traditionalists and even women hate to admit it, women are just as much individuals as men are, and therefore not this monolith of the downtrodden. Pity for women's painful childbirth? Not only have these been a simple fact of natural motherly life, but there has been an increasing medical advances to mitigate the physically demanding aspects of it, including epidurals and anesthetics. It's not in the public consciousness, if it ever was, this notion that women as mothers were seen as expendable creatures, unlike men. Hence the notion of women as the sacrificial sex by default is complete nonsense. So we can thus realize that men have been and are being brought down to a level that never really existed for women. They were brought down for nothing and below women. This is the psychosis of the worship of the downtrodden female, that is gynocentrism. And if men have any sense of dignity, and if women desire to forsake that privilege of the downtrodden and the pitiable, they must know that gynocentrism must end. Number 1, gynocentrism is the call to male altruism. Whether you think altruism, selflessness in other words, is a good or bad thing, what I can tell you for sure is a simple, hard truth, that gynocentrism requires a great deal of it from men in service to women. Whether you think altruism is a good or bad thing, what we should be able to agree on is that it is about relinquishing self for the sake of others. It stands to reason that men are called upon to relinquish their lives in the form of self-sacrifice, self-disposal, accepting expendable treatment, and in any case, being on their knees for the sake of the designated others, the women. Gynocentrism and altruism go hand in hand. Altruism is the moral tool used to enforce gynocentric norms. Those who live the blue pill gynocentric course of their lives and those who preach and enforce those norms are universally supportive of the alleged virtues of altruism, selflessness, anti-self morality. Altruism ultimately is the philosophy that calls upon the self-sacrifice of those preached to for the sake of another group deemed the downtrodden and the needing. I've established that in the gynocentric worldview, men are the privileged class and women the downtrodden and already sacrificed. The altruism utilized by gynocentrism requires that men be brought down and women be lifted up. This is true of both gynocentrisms, the feminist and traditionalist conservative. The general definition of gynocentrism, as outlined in gynocentrism.com, dominant or exclusive focus on women in theory or practice, or to the advocacy of this, sometimes practiced to the detriment of non-females. Contrary to what is now popular belief, for humans there are two sexes. It follows that the same gynocentrism that pedestalizes females needs the non-female sex to do the lifting involved in this pedestalizing, clearly the males. The formula is simple. In order for women to be above, the men must go below. If humans have a sense of egalitarianism in the meaningful sense of the word, that we are all worthy of equal rights and respect, then there is only one effective way to market the gynocentric condition, and that is to pretend that things aren't equal. Namely, women are the undeservedly low, and men are the undeservedly above, both by design. The preachers of gynocentrism will show you a man willingly on his knees and a woman looking down upon him with condescension, and will call it equality. We see it in sayings such as the future is female and all female gatherings. Those are referred to as equality. They call for the killing of all men, and those kinds of sentiments are deemed acceptable, and this is referred to as equality. If men are called upon to accept this norm, then it is the same thing to a call to their selflessness. They want men to voluntarily relinquish themselves for the sake of womankind, all for it. This is the reality of gynocentrism, altruism as its biggest culprit. And if it uses altruism as outlined just now, is altruism in any way moral and good? If gynocentrism is the call to male self-sacrifice, one must then ask themselves this question. Do you preach or at least tolerate gynocentrism because you think self-sacrifice is somehow good, or do you object to gynocentrism because of the demands upon men's lives to be an expendable existence? I don't think you can have it both ways. This has been the 5 Hard Truths About Gynocentrism and Why It Must End. Thank you for watching. If you find value in my message, please consider supporting me on Subscribestar. Every bit really does help. Also, special thanks to Peter Wright of gynocentrism.com for his support.